The Life and Works of Rizal. Good day everyone, I am Shaira G. Pabro, one of your discussant for today, in which I will discuss the Philippines a century hence. So, the Philippines a century hence is originally written in Spanish as Pilipinas dentro de 100 años. This article was originally published serially in the Filipino Fortnightly Review, La Solidaridad of Madrid, running through the issues from September year 1889 to January year 1890. It is a socio-political essay written in 4 parts in magazine La Solidaridad by Jose Rizal. So aside from that, it is one of the most significant political works of the movement in Spain. Rizal tracing the circumstances that brought about the awakening of the Filipino and consequently the birth of the Filipino spirit of a nation. It supplements Rizal's great novel, which is the Noli Me Tangere, and its sequel, El Filibusterismo. The translation here given is fortunately by Mr. Charles Derbyshire, who in his The Social Cancer and the Reign of Creed has so happily rendered into English those masterpieces of Rizal. Charles Derbyshire was an American translator active around the turn of the 20th century. Aside from that, his most famous translations were of the poetry and novels of the Filipino writer and political activist Jose Rizal, which is the Noli Me Tangere and El Filibusterismo, both of which were published in year 1912. He also translated Rizal's farewell poem, posthumously titled Mi Ultimo Adios, which he published in year 1911. The reference which Dr. Rizal makes to President Harrison had in mind the grandson of his grandfather's blundering, wavering policy that, because of a groundless fear of infringing the natives' natural rights, put his country in the false light of wanting to share in Samoa's exploitation, taking the Leonine portion too, along with Germany and England. Robert Louis Stevenson has told the story of the unhappy condition created by that disastrous international agreement, which was achieved by the dissembling diplomats of greedy Europe flattering unsophisticated America into believing that two monarchies preponderating in an alliance with a republic would be better than the republic acting unhampered. So, in its day, the scheme was acclaimed by irrational idealists as a triumph of American abnegation and an example of modern altruism. It resulted that the international agreement became a constant cause of international disagreements. As many students of history could have foretold, until disgusted and disillusioned, the United States tardily recalled Washington's warning against entanglements with foreign powers and became a party to a real partition, but this time playing Lamb's part. England was compensated with concessions in other parts of the world. The United States was given what it already held under a cession 27 years old, and Germany took the rest as her emperor had planned from the start. Robert Louis Stevenson was a Scottish novelist, poet, and travel writer. Aside from that, he is most noted for Treasure Island, Kidnap, A Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and A Child's Garden of Verses. He is born and educated in Edinburgh. Stevenson suffered from serious bronchial trouble for much of his life, but continued to write prolifically and travel widely in defiance of his poor health. There is this Philippine bearing to the incident that the same stripe of unpractical philanthropies not discouraged at having forced the Samoans under the ungentle German rule, for their victims and not themselves suffer by their mistakes, are seeking now the neutralization by international agreement of the archipelago for which Rizal gave his life. So their success would mean another entangling alliance for the United States, with 6 allies, or 9, including Holland, China, and Spain. If the Great Republic should be allowed by the diplomats of the great powers to invite these nonentities in world politics, with whom she would still be outvoted. Rizal's reference to America as a possible factor in the Philippines' future is based upon the prediction of the German traveler Fyodor Jagor, who about year 1860 spent a number of months in the islands and later published his observations, supplemented by 10 years of further study in European libraries and museums. As Travels in the Philippines used the title of the English translation, a very poor one, by the way. So Rizal read the much better Spanish version while a student in the Ateneo de Manila, from a copy supplied by Pasiano Rizal Mercado, who directed his younger brother's political education and transferred to Jose the hopes which had been blighted for himself by the execution of his beloved teacher, Father Burgos, in the Cavite alleged insurrection. Jagor's prophecy furnishes the explanation of Rizal's public life. His policy of preparing his countrymen for industrial and commercial competition seems to have had its inspiration in this reading done when he was a youth in years but mature in fact through close contact with tragic public events as well as with sensational private sorrows. So when in Berlin, Germany, Dr. Rizal met Professor Jagor, and the distinguished geographer and his youthful but brilliant admirer became fast friends, often discussing how the progress of events was bringing through the fortune for the Philippines, which the knowledge of its history and the acquaintance with its then condition had enabled the trained observer to foretell with the same certainty that the meteorologist foretells the morrow's weather. Andreas Fyodor Jagor was a German ethnologist, naturalist, and explorer who traveled throughout Asia in the second half of the 19th century, collecting for Berlin museums. So Rizal met for the first time Dr. Fyodor Jagor, celebrated German scientist, traveler, and author of Travels in the Philippines, a book which Rizal read and admired during his student days in Manila. Fyodor Jagor visited the Philippines in year 1859 to 1860. Travel in the Philippines was published in Berlin in year 1873. In this book, Dr. Jagor foretold the downfall of Spanish rule in the Philippines and the coming of America to the Philippine shores. Alike political acumen Rizal tried to develop in his countrymen. He republished Morga's history that first published in Mexico in year 1609 to recall their past. No Limitang painted their present, and in El Filibusterismo was sketched the future which continuance upon their then course must bring. So the Philippines a century hence suggests other possibilities and seems to have been the initial issue in the series of 10 which Rizal planned to print. One a year to correct the misunderstanding of his previous writings which had come from their being known mainly by the extracts cited in the censor's criticism. Jose Rizal in life voiced the aspirations of his countrymen and as the different elements in his divided native and land recognized that these were the essentials upon which all were agreed and that their points of difference among themselves were not vital. Dissension disappeared and there came an united Philippines. So now, since his death, the fact that both continental and insular Americans look to him as their hero makes possible the hope that misunderstandings based on differences as to details may cease when Filipinos recognize that the American government and the Philippines properly approach is willing to grant all that Rizal considered important and when Americans understand that the people of the Philippines, unaccustomed to the frank discussions of democracy, would be content with so little even as Rizal as of Spain if only there were some salve for their unwittingly wounded amor proprio. A better knowledge of the writings of Jose Rizal may accomplish this desirable consummation. I do not write for this generation. I am writing for other ages. If this could read me, they would burn my books, the work of my whole life. On the other hand, the generation which interprets these writings will be an educated generation. They will understand me and say, not all were asleep in the nighttime of our grandparents. From the philosopher Tasio in Noli Me Tangere. So now, let us proceed to the discussion of the Philippines a century hence, Chapter 1, that focus about the analysis of the Philippines and the causes of sufferings, as well as the awakening of the desire for justice and equality. Following our usual custom of pacing squarely the most difficult and delicate questions relating to the Philippines without weighing the consequences that our frankness may bring upon us, we shall in the present article treat of their future. So in order to read the destiny of a people, it is necessary to open the book of its past, and this, for the Philippines, may be reduced in general terms to what follows. Scarcely they had been attached to the Spanish crown that they had to sustain with their blood, and the efforts of their sons, the wars, and ambition of conquest of the Spanish people. And in the struggles, in the terrible crisis, when a people changes its form of government, it lost usages, customs, religion, and beliefs. The Philippines were depopulated, impoverished, and retarded, in which they caught in their metamorphosis, without confidence in their past, without faith in their present, and with no planned hope for the years to come. The former rulers who had merely endeavored to secure the fear and submission of their subjects, habituated by them to servitude, fell like leaves from a dead tree, and the people, who had no love for them, nor knew what liberty was, easily changed masters, perhaps hoping to gain something by the innovation. Then began a new era for the Filipinos. They gradually lost their ancient traditions, their recollections. They forgot their writings, their songs, their poetry, their laws, in order to learn by heart other doctrines which they did not understand, other ethics, other tastes different from those inspired in their race by their climate and their way of thinking. Then there was a falling off. They were lowered in their own eyes. They became ashamed of what was distinctively their own, in order to admire and praise what was foreign and incomprehensible. Their spirit was broken, and they acquiesced. Thus years and centuries rolled on. Religious shows, rites that caught the eye, songs, lights, images arrayed with gold, worship in a strange language, legends, miracles, and sermons hypnotized the already naturally superstitious spirit of the country, but did not succeed in destroying it altogether. In spite of the whole system afterwards developed and operated with unyielding tenacity. So when the ethical abasement of the inhabitants had reached this stage, when they had become disheartened and disgusted with themselves, an effort was made to add the final stroke for reducing so many dormant wills and intellects to nothingness, in order to make of the individual a sort of toiler, a brute, a beast of burden, and to develop a race without mind or heart. Then the end sought was revealed. It was taken for granted. The race was insulted. An effort was made to deny it every virtue, every human characteristic, and there were even writers and priests who pushed the movement still farther by trying to deny to the natives of the country not only capacity for virtue but also even the tendency to vice. Then this which they had thought would be death was sure salvation. Some dying persons are restored to health by a heroic remedy. So great endurance reached its climax with the insults, and the lethargic spirit woke to life. His sensitiveness, the chief trait of the native, was touched, and while he had the forbearance to suffer and die under a foreign flag, he had it not when they whom he served repaid his sacrifices with insults and jests. Then he began to study himself and to realize his misfortune. Those who had not expected this result, like all despotic masters, regarded as a wrong every complaint, every protest, and punished it with death, endeavoring thus to stifle every cry of sorrow with blood, and they made mistake after mistake. The spirit of the people was not thereby cowed, and even though it had been awakened in only a few hearts, its flame nevertheless was surely and consumingly propagated, thanks to abuses and the stupid endeavors of certain classes to stifle noble and generous sentiments. Thus, when a flame catches a garment, fear and confusion propagate it more and more, and each shake, each blow is a blast from the bellows to fan it into life. So now, here are the causes of the miseries suffered by the Filipino people. First one is the Spain's implementation of military policies. Because of such laws, the Philippine population decreased dramatically. So by that, poverty became more rampant than ever, and farmlands were left to wither. The family as a unit of society was neglected, and overall, every aspect of the life of the Filipino was retarded. Second is the deterioration and disappearance of Filipino indigenous culture. When Spain came with the sword and the cross, it began the gradual destruction of the native Philippine culture. Because of this, the Filipinos started losing confidence in their past and their heritage. They became doubtful of their present lifestyle and eventually lost hope in the future and the preservation of their race. And the third one is the passivity and submissiveness to the Spanish colonizers. One of the most powerful forces that influenced a culture of silence among the natives were the Spanish priors. So because of the use of force, the Filipinos learned to submit themselves to the will of the foreigners. The question then arises as to what had awakened the hearts and opened the minds of the Filipino people with regards to their flight. Eventually, the natives realized that such oppression in their society by foreign colonizers must no longer be tolerated. Undoubtedly, during all this time, there were not lacking generous and noble spirits among the dominant race that tried to struggle for the rights of humanity and justice, or sordid and cowardly ones among the dominated that aided the debasement of their own country. But both were exceptions, and we are speaking in general terms. Such is an outline of their past. We know their present. Now, what will their future be? Will the Philippine Islands continue to be a Spanish colony? And if so, what kind of colony? Will they become a province of Spain, with or without autonomy? And to reach this stage, what kind of sacrifices will have to be made? Will they be separated from the mother country to live independently, to fall into the hands of other nations, or to ally themselves with neighboring powers? It is possible to reply these questions, for to all them both yes and no may be answered, according to the time desired to be covered. When there is in nature no fixed condition, how much less must there be in the life of a people, beings endowed with mobility and movement? So it is that in order to deal with these questions, it is necessary to presume an unlimited period of time in accordance therewith try to forecast future events. One question Rizal raises in this essay is whether or not Spain can indeed prevent the progress of the Philippines. First one is keeping the people uneducated and ignorant had failed, because national consciousness had still awakened, and great Filipino minds still emerged from the rubble. And second is keeping the people impoverished also came to no avail, because on the contrary, living a life of eternal destitution had allowed the Filipino to act on the desire for a change in their way of life. They began to explore other horizons through which they could move towards progress. And the third one is exterminating the people as an alternative to hindering progress did not work either, because the Filipino race was able to survive amidst wars and famine, and became even more numerous after such catastrophes. To wipe out the nation altogether would require the sacrifice of thousands of Spanish soldiers. Spain, therefore, had no means to stop the progress of the country. What she needs to do is to change her colonial policies so that they are in keeping with the needs of the Philippine society and to the rising nationalism of the people. So, the Philippines a century hence of Dr. Jose Rizal is talking about the future of the Philippines and what would happen. That reminds the Filipinos about the state of our country, Philippines, in the near future. Well, it is significant today because we all have challenges and problems that we are currently facing. So that we have to look more into the future to somehow base in our decisions regarding what we are going through. Like in the essay, Jose Rizal is talking about what had happened that will have an effect in the future of the Philippines. And that would be the end of my discussion. Again, I am Shaira G. Pabro. Thank you.